We're going to solve for angles in right triangles using right triangle trigonometry. So in the center there, I've got sine, cosine, and tangent all written out with their ratios according to the sides. Okay, and we're going to use those to solve 17 and 25 here at the top of the screen. So the first thing I always do, anytime I do a right triangle trig problem is I automatically start shading. So I find what I'm looking for. I find an angle, and in this case, we are looking for an angle, and I'm going to shade that angle. Once I have that angle shaded, that just helps me indicate where I am going to start. After that, I start labeling all my sides. Across from the 90 is the hypotenuse, okay? After we have the hypotenuse labeled, I go back to the angle that we shaded, and I look for the opposite and the adjacent. So I go clear across the triangle. That's the opposite, okay? And then when I turn and I go next to it, I have to turn towards the other side that's missing. That's not the hypotenuse, that is the adjacent, okay? Once I've got that, I can start determining what trig ratio I need to use. So in this case, you'll notice we do not have the hypotenuse, but our goal is simply to find this angle D. So we're going to find the angle D, given that we have an opposite and an adjacent. So I have to determine which trig ratio. I have an opposite and I have an adjacent. Well, if we look at the trig ratios, for example, sine, that's the opposite and hypotenuse, but that doesn't work because I don't have the hypotenuse. It's not cosine because I have the adjacent, but I don't have the hypotenuse. So I can mark those off, okay? And then when I go to the last one, I say, okay, I'm looking for the angle, and I have the opposite and I have the adjacent. I must be using tangent. So I'm simply going to put in tangent of D equals to opposite, and the opposite we indicated was 107, over the adjacent, which is 128. Now, in a previous video, we looked at how do we actually solve this type of problem. We use the inverse, and the inverse allows us, the inverse solves for angles. And how we indicate that is simple. We just write tan inverse of 107 over 128 equals to D. That's how we actually write that whole entire statement out. Now, once we have that, we need to go over to Desmos. And of course, we got to go to Desmos. Desmos is the most helpful tool. I'm going to go to the wrench, which is graphing settings. And I'm going to make sure that I am in the correct mode. It is highlighted radians. We need to be in degrees. Okay, so I'm going to go to degrees. And then I'm going to come up to the cell and I'm just going to type it in as it is. Tan inverse. I write it in as an exponent, even though it is not an exponent. It's just telling us that it's the inverse. And I'm going to write in 107 divided by 128. Okay, that tells me that that angle D must be 39.89, or let's just say that D for simplicity is, we'll round it up to 40 degrees. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Okay. Now, let's go over to our next problem with the number 25, and we will solve that one and get that one organized. So I'm going to do the exact same thing I did in the last problem. Is I'm going to start by shading things. So you'll notice that there is a circle and we have a diameter. Okay, so we have a diameter, okay, which is right here. And one thing we learned in previous classes is that if we have an inscribed angle off the diameter, it is a 90-degree angle back here. Okay, so that is a right triangle in our picture. So let's go ahead and highlight that it is a 90-degree angle. Okay, now I label my sides, and I'm going to shade my angle and label my sides. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, I'm looking for A. I'm looking for A. This is the hypotenuse, and I know it's the hypotenuse because it's clear across from the right angle. Okay, and from there, I am going to label my opposite and my adjacent. So opposite is clear across, okay? And then adjacent is right next to it. That is not the hypotenuse, okay? Once I have that, I say, okay, I go through the same process I did before. I am going to go through my sine, cosine, and tangent. I have the opposite and I have the adjacent. Which one has both of those in it? Well, it is tangent again. What? We showed up with the same one. So I'm going to write tangent of A equals to 14 opposite, 14, over adjacent, which is 26. Now, we are looking for the angle. So once again, we need to use that inverse. So tangent inverse, and I just type in 14 over 26 equals to A. Now, got to go back to Desmos, because if we're not in Desmos, we're not doing this right probably. So I come back over to Desmos. I'm going to make sure I'm still in degree mode, and we are. And I'm going to type tangent inverse, okay, of 14 divided by 26. And when I have that in there, tangent inverse 1426, it tells me 28.3. So A equals to 28.3 degrees. I hope that helps with solving for missing angles in triangles. Good luck with the next few problems.